Hi, I'm Natalie Baker, and I'm giving a presentation on neurofeedback for kids. Thank you for joining. I know a lot of you are going to watch this as a recording later. The goal is to finish in 30 minutes, but given the number of questions we received, it might go a little longer. But feel free at any point to ask a question, although we will have time at the end for anybody to ask any clarifying questions. So the inspiration for this webinar was really just to give parents an opportunity to have one place where they could come and gather more educational material about neurofeedback training for kids. Because I would say about 50 to 60% of our neurofeedback rentals are to families who are training children or training the whole family. And I know parents really like to get educated. So in that spirit, let's begin. So just to talk a little bit about what we're going to review in this presentation. The emphasis is going to be on explaining how neurofeedback, specifically NeurOptimal, is safe to use for children. And I'm going to start with talking a little bit about neurofeedback in general. But we have another webinar, which is an overview of the NeurOptimal system and how it works. And so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I'm just going to encourage you to watch that webinar for a deeper dive into how the system works. Next, we're going to talk about best practices, how to get the most out of your neurofeedback training when you're training kids. And then I'm going to address specific conditions. I had a lot of questions from parents who were asking about training for different conditions in children. So we'll go into that. And then finally, the opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to start by just talking about neurofeedback in general. In case you're not aware, neurofeedback is a branch of biofeedback, and it is specifically giving the system, our automatic functioning brain system, feedback about its behavior, and specifically its electrical behavior. So the brain communicates through chemicals and through electricity. And with neurofeedback, we are measuring and making meaning of the electrical communication of the brain. So there are EEG sensors that are attached to the head, and they take that electrical communication from the head, and it's sent into an amplifier, which amplifies the communication, and then that's sent into a computer, which analyzes that data. Welcome everybody who's just joining us. So neurofeedback is taking that electrical communication and through auditory or visual feedback, alerting the brain to its own activity. And so the brain can then change itself to optimize its functioning. So the goal being that the brain then changes from maladaptive brainwaves to adaptive or normative brainwaves. So symptoms, we could say, are reflected in the fact that the brain is functioning in a way that is producing brainwave patterns that are not appropriate for the here and now. So for example, when we're going to sleep, we're supposed to create a lot of those low, slow moving brain waves, delta waves, which is part of how we transition into sleep. So now I want to talk a little bit about neurofeedback as an industry. So neurofeedback is a process, and it's an unregulated word. So you're going to have a lot of different devices calling themselves neurofeedback, and it does not mean they operate the same way. So as example, I've seen systems call themselves neurofeedback, and they have no EEG sensors. So they're not even measuring brain waves. And also there are microcurrent stimulators that call themselves neurofeedback. And that's very different because you're actually adding a microcurrent to the brain in order to change it. So you're actually adding something to the system. And with pure neurofeedback, and in particular NeurOptimal, which is the system that I use and is the one I'm going to be talking about, it is purely feedback for the brain. So it's non-invasive. So that's just something to be aware of. When a system calls itself neurofeedback, don't assume that all systems are the same or they're talking about the same kind of intervention. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so this is a very important topic for parents, which is, whenever you're looking for an intervention or a tool or a treatment to help a child, parents are always very concerned about safety. So let me talk about the NeurOptimal system and explain why it is safe to use at any age. And I have seen it used on babies who've had brain aneurysms very effectively. So why is it safe to use at any age? So number one is that it's non-invasive. So those EEG sensors that are placed on the sides of the head and they're clipped to the ears, and there's a couple photos coming up where you'll see specifically what it looks like. That's purely taking information, electrical communication information from the brain and being fed to the computer. The computer is reading those electrical communications and looking for electrical shifting. It's called turbulence that happens when the brain's about to change states. And whenever it notices that, and it's checking 256 times per second. So the brain is making a lot of decisions every second. The software is looking for that change. And in the millisecond that it registers change, it interrupts music that the child is listening to. And so auditory feedback is the way we cue the brain that something is changing, pay attention. So in the same way that if you're lost in thought and somebody calls your name and you become aware in the present moment, in the same way that automatic unconscious brain becomes aware when the music stops, it alerts it to pay attention. So what it's going to see is what it's doing that's maladaptive. In particular, that's what we want it to see, so that it will then correct itself. So we are not adding anything to the system. It's more like presenting a mirror to that brain so that it can see clearly what it's doing, and then it can decide whether or not it wants to change anything. So in the same way, if you show up in front of a mirror and your head is tilted, you're going to shift and align your head on your spine just naturally. So that's the type of intervention we're talking about. We're talking about an intervention that's non-invasive. It's purely information for the brain to see, right? We want it to see what it's doing habitually that's maladaptive in particular. And then that brain will actually correct itself. So let's use the example, of an ADHD brain, right? So that ADHD brain is habituated to being in scanning mode, right? Well, when we have work in front of us, homework, we need our focusing brainwaves. So what happens when a child does a NeurOptimal session is that in the moment of training, it is going to shift based on what it sees that's maladaptive, but it's actually learning something over time. And it's learning that all the good information is in the present moment. So I'm going to learn to practice coming into the present, gathering data, because I'm going to make more efficient and more effective decisions. More efficient, I'm going to use less energy. More effective, it's actually going to be a better decision based on the here and now needs. So that scanning brain, right, when it's brain training, it's learning, wow, I'm constantly scanning the environment, and why? Well, we're supposed to use our scanning brain when there is imminent danger. It's part of the stress response. So that brain is then going, oh, but I got homework in front of me, right? So it's now practicing, but I got to come into the present, see what my actual needs are. Oh, I got homework in front of me. So that scanning brain will now shift and start using its focusing brainwaves. And then Johnny just starts doing his math homework. So that's just an example of very sort of briefly how it works and how it, how it is a safe product. And again, I'm going to refer you to our other webinar for a longer explanation of, how the system works. So there's also no such thing as overtraining. So what the brain does when it's tired is it ignores information. So if you're training regularly and, that day the kid's tired and the brain is done, finished, and you're doing a neurofeedback session, if it doesn't want to keep learning in that present moment, it's just going to ignore the information. So there's no such thing as overtraining. There's also no overtraining because with NeurOptimal, the trainer, which is, basically the individual's own brain, there is no external trainer who is setting protocols. So protocol neurofeedback is a type of neurofeedback where the trainer sets protocols based on either a diagnosis or a brain map, which shows which brain regions have too much alpha or too little beta or whatever. And then the trainer will set the protocols to sort of nudge the brain out of the maladaptive and into the adaptive brain waves. And that's the first generation of neurofeedback. It was created when computers didn't operate at the speed of the human brain. So you had to take out some of the functioning. But with NeurOptimal, because it was designed with current computer power in mind, it was designed to give real-time feedback. And so it is a fully automated system, and it's purely giving feedback about what is maladaptive in the present moment. So it makes it a much more precise system. And that's also why you can do home training, is because the system's fully automated. There are no protocols to set. And there's no forcing of a state change. So when you're doing protocol neurofeedback, there is this principle called overtraining, because, it's an art rather than a science in terms of like how much to train that brain to go into alpha, for example. And so people can report, oh, I'm feeling a little kind of hyper-focused, and we call that overtraining. It's not a problem. It's not permanent. The brain will adjust itself. But that kind of sort of temporary side effecting doesn't happen with the NeurOptimal system. And the other thing is that the home system that you use, so a lot of our families, when they decide to do brain training with NeurOptimal, opt for home sessions rather than coming into the office, because it's much easier and it's more affordable. And just also to know that it's the exact same technology as we use in our office. So you're getting the exact same quality training when you train at home versus in an office. So here are some images of a NeurOptimal session. The child on the left here playing with the video game, that's my daughter when she was about 12. She's now 18. And you can see in the background there's the Surface tablet that runs the software. She's listening to the music through the speakers. Kids tend to prefer having the music in the environment rather than right in their ears. And it doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be a volume that they can hear. We want that automatic brain to be able to listen to the music. She has the volume off on her video game. And the amplifier is the little box in the background there that changes that voltage into numbers, amplifying the brain waves and canceling out the 60 hertz line noise that's in the environment. And the girl on the right here is just demonstrating where the sensors go. They're roughly halfway between the tops of the ears and the crown of the head. It's a big area. You don't have to worry about being super precise. But you do want the sensors to be firmly pressed against the head. You use EEG paste to do that. And so one of the things that we recommend is if kids have a lot of hair, that you really part the hair, put a clip or barrette back, and then when you smush the sensor down on the head, it's not weighted down by the hair. But then the reference sensors are on the tops of the ears, and then there's a grounding sensor here on the right earlobe. And with kids, they move their heads around more. So I always encourage parents, check and just make sure the sensors are firmly pressed about every 10, 15 minutes. The session length is 33 minutes. And because the feedback is auditory, they can be doing something else visually. And because we are training that automatic functioning brain rather than the prefrontal cortex conscious brain, kids can be doing other things while the sessions are going on. So that's why my daughter is playing a video game while she's doing her neurofeedback session. So let's talk about best practices when it comes to neurofeedback. So I'm going to start with number 3 here, which is the number one complaint that we get from people who train at home is that they absolutely love the training. However, they wish they had done it more often. So really the only issue from my point of view that is an obstacle for training is actually doing the sessions. And so that is sort of our biggest concern, is making sure that parents are set up for success to actually run the sessions, because it's fully automated and you saw the hookups very easy. Learning how to run sessions will take you 15 minutes. The bigger challenge is getting those sessions to happen. So if you're a parent who is in charge of your household and in charge of what your kids do, then I would say, you can say as much as you think is helpful about it or as little as you think is helpful, because they don't have to understand what is going on in order for it to be successful. I find with ADHD kids, because so many kids' self-esteem is impacted by the fact that their brains aren't doing what they want them to do, and they blame it on themselves, like their conscious selves. I think it's a really great thing to tell those kids, we're going to train your brain so that it learns to do the right thing, which has nothing to do with what you're trying to make happen. It has everything to do with a part of your brain that's on autopilot. And so allowing kids to do something fun, make it a reward, makes it a lot easier, especially if your kids are the decider. So I know one parent asked, when's the best time to train an adolescent? Anytime, any age is good. And if you need your kids' buy-in in order for the sessions to happen, then make them an offer they can't refuse. And whatever that is, whether you let them have their video game time, or, you can, give them some sort of reward for doing the session. Again, our number one goal is for the session to happen. And so try not to make it a point of struggle. Really just think about what's going to get them to consent to doing it. And, another way to talk about neurofeedback to your children, for those who are interested, and I know someone had a question about that, kids understand that, a healthy body, a strong body is a body that gets exercise. And so in the same way, a healthy brain is a brain that gets exercise. And what we're doing with the neurofeedback is we're training the brain. We're training the brain to function at its best. In the same way, you know, you see adults going for runs, or you're playing soccer, or you see people lifting weights. Right now we have this tool that helps our brain to get the exercise that it needs to function at its best. So again, you know your kids best in terms of what is going to help them to relax, to feel good about participating in this. And they don't need to understand it in order for it to work. My daughter had no clue about what this thing was that her mom made her do until she was about 13. So from the age of 6, when my daughter started, until she was 13, she just like, when anybody would ask her, what is that? She's like, I don't know, that's my mom's brain thing. And also for those first 6 years, whenever I would ask her, do you notice anything from doing the brain training? She would say, no, I don't notice anything. It wasn't until she was, she was about 14, and she had an incident with nosebleeds and almost passed out. And that set up a fear response to having nosebleeds. And it was very interesting. She came to me and said, Mom, I want to do the brain machine every day until I stop being afraid of getting nosebleeds. And I was shocked that she said this, because up until this point, we really didn't have any conversations about how it works or when you should use it. And so I really kind of understood this to be her own system communicating that it understood what it was good for and asking for it. And to her credit, every day for 11 days, she did the neurofeedback. She asked for it. And on the 12th day, she said, nope, Mom, I'm good. I don't need it. And true to form, she was not afraid of getting nosebleeds after that point. So it's very interesting. I mean, my daughter was the one who really taught me that, you know, you don't have to use words in order for kids to understand what something does, that through their own felt experience, they can learn and they can appreciate it. So don't worry if your kids aren't giving you any feedback about how much better they feel. You know, really trusting that this system is always about helping that brain optimize itself through giving it that mirror over and over again to understand what it's doing that's habitual and maladaptive, as opposed to habitual and adaptive or appropriate for the here and now. So the other big factor in success for children is when a parent, a primary caregiver, also does the neurofeedback sessions. And that's part of why we encourage parents to rent a system, is because it's easier for multiple people to train at home. And the reason for that is because nervous systems are connected. We are survival animals at our core, and this is our survival brain that produces a lot of the symptoms that we find in anxiety, ADHD, night terrors, PTSD, depression, all these things. And so the way it works in a family system is that the nervous systems are connected, and the child's nervous system is connected to the parent nervous system. And so when a child is doing their brain training, they're going to want to come. Let me just show my little graphy graph here. So here is my stress response, right? So right here is a regulated brain. So it's in a state of calm, it's open, it's creative, it's relaxed. The brain is perceiving safety in the present moment. Hyperarousal, that's the fight flight. Hypoarousal, that's the depressive collapsed response. Those two zones are when the brain is mistakenly thinking that there is danger in the here and now. And so that primitive brain is using that fight, flight, freeze energy, right? So the hypervigilant scanning of the ADHD brain, that's part of the hyper response. So that kid, when they're doing neurofeedback, is automatically that nervous system is going to check in with the parent nervous system as it wants to go into regulation, out of dysregulation. Ooh, but is it safe? Is it okay? And if the parent is also doing the neurofeedback, even though they may not have, some mental health condition or, something diagnosable, they do have stress, right? So we all know that we can hover around that fight flight energy, that freeze response energy. And so the parent's brain is going to get more regulated, right? Because when the brain comes into the present moment, it sees safety. Oh, there's no danger. Why am I doing a stress response? I'm only supposed to do that when there's imminent danger. It takes a lot of energy to do a stress response. So that brain is naturally going to come regulated. So when the child's nervous system feels into the parent's nervous system and the parent is regulated, which means safety, then the child's nervous system is more confident about also being regulated. And that's how those nervous systems support each other. I just listened to a really great interview with a psychiatrist who is an expert in addictions and, of course, trauma, because most addictions are born out of traumatic experiences, unfortunately. And he talked about how parent and child nervous systems are connected. And in our follow-up email, I'll send a link to that. And so you can, if you're interested in learning more about that, that interview was a good one. So, okay. So if parents train along with the kids, that's a super helpful thing. And also just to say that when we are more regulated, our communication style becomes more responsive and less reactive. And so that is another reason why things work better when parents are training as well. And when we're calmer, we're also much more organized. It's much more easy to be organized. So parents who are also training, it becomes much easier to know and figure out how to schedule everybody's sessions because we're not in reactive mode. So those are other reasons why it's beneficial if the parent also trains. Another really important thing is to think about this as a holistic process of brain health rather than medical intervention to fix a mental health condition. And we've all been conditioned by the Western medical model and the pharmaceutical industry to think about the one pill wonder, that one thing that is going to fix it. And this is really about understanding how we help optimize brain health. Symptoms are born in part out of not being in a state of health. And so really thinking about what are all the pieces that come together to create optimal brain health, rather than thinking we're just going to do the one thing and that one thing should be enough for the results we want to see. And so just to talk a little bit more about what are all the components that help our brains function at their best. One of the biggest things in our current culture is that children don't sleep enough. Children need 10 to 12 hours a night, 10 really for adolescents. And as many of you know who have adolescents, the school systems have started being more responsive and moving up the start time for high school, because the research shows, if kids sleep more, they perform better at school, they have better mental health. It's just a win-win-win. So think about best sleep practices for your kids. Another big contributor is diet. So busy lifestyle, food industry that loves to put sugar in everything, really not good for the brain. So this is a bigger topic, and, you know, something that maybe over time you can just take a look at and think about. How do we help transition from a highly processed foods, high sugar, high refined grain diet to a whole foods diet with less sugar? And there's lots and lots of research coming out about inflammation and how brain inflammation impacts mental health symptoms. And also research on ADHD symptoms and anxiety in children actually really being about food additives and food dyes and food allergies. So just a topic to think about. I know it's a hard one for some families, but we've definitely had instances where parents have not seen results from the neurofeedback after a month. And that's typically when we ask the question, tell me about Sarah's diet. How are you feeding your kids? What are they eating? Because that can be a significant contributor to what we call mental health symptoms. And I put it in quotes because, you know, it's not necessarily born out of, you know, issues having to do with what we consider to be typical for being anxious or having ADHD. Exercise. Hands down, you ask any honest psychiatrist and they will tell you exercise is the #1 antidepressant out there. It really is so important for brain health, for mood. And so just to think about, you know, in terms of overall health, how are we doing with exercise? And then #4, are we having enough fun? Is there enough affection in our days? And how important those things are for overall health, right? A brain that's stuck in that hypervigilant, hyperarousal or hypoarousal is not a brain that is having fun. Fun happens when we're regulated. So if we create the conditions for fun, then it helps the brain come out of those dysregulated states and come into a state of regulation. And the last thing is our parenting style. And if you find that you are, like many of us, quick to react with irritation, if your parenting style is a little chaotic, if there's a little too much anger in the household, that will absolutely impact the child because that communicates that we're in an unsafe environment. And so the best thing for shifting your parenting is to do the NeurOptimal. As that brain re-regulates and calms down, right, then we are able to be more responsive in our parenting style. So being able to be calm, you know, be collaborative when appropriate, set healthy expectations, things like that. So those are some of the things that create a holistic set of resources for children to be able to shift out of what's maladaptive and into what's adaptive. And so now let's really go into specific conditions, because most parents come to exploring neurofeedback because they're either, you know, just doing kind of armchair diagnosing of their kids, or they have a real diagnosis from a healthcare provider and they're looking for the supports or interventions to help. And so one of the things I want to just reiterate is that this is helping the brain to learn how to function at its best. And when you teach the brain to function differently, symptoms shift. So we don't think about this as treatment for conditions. We think about this as brain training for optimal health. And when you optimize health, symptoms shift. And so I'll go through, these are the conditions that people specifically ask questions about. Anxiety is in the stress response, that's zone number 1. And that's that fight flight energy, right? So what's happening there is the brain is stuck in a habit of thinking that the environment is unsafe. Again, the stress response is that automatic functioning brain's strategy for resolving an eminently dangerous situation. So the brain defines danger as in less than a minute. And so that's why it works independent of our contemplative brain, which is our prefrontal cortex, which goes, oh, should I do this or should I do this, right? It's our planning brain. When it comes to imminent danger, we don't have time, right, to consult with the prefrontal cortex. So this part of the brain's on autopilot. And so it gets a simple cue from the environment and it goes, we're in danger. And it does that unconsciously. It's not a conscious decision. And then it just uses simple cues to reinforce that patterning and keep it going. And so zone number 3 is the depressive energy. Number 1 is more what you see with ADHD and anxiety. OCD, which is technically an anxiety condition, but it's interesting. It's actually a different part of the brain that is active in an OCD person than like generalized anxiety or phobias. And I have found that it is longer to train. So whereas when a parent comes to me and says, my kid has night terrors or, got bit by a dog and is afraid of dogs now, or, over COVID, it's just created, stranger danger and is very anxious about leaving the house. Typically with those kids, assuming again that we have a relatively healthy lifestyle, those kids train, 2 to 3 to 4 times a week for 2 months, 2 to 3 months. And usually they're really good to go and symptoms resolve and in a good place. With OCD, it takes longer. In my experience, it's about 3 to 6 months of regular training with some, cognitive behavioral modification training as well. And it's good to start with the NeurOptimal, let that brain get a little bit more regulated, and then add the behavioral piece, because a reactive brain is not a brain that easily learns. So first we want to bring it more into regulation, then add the cognitive behavioral piece secondarily. If it's not too intense, you can do both at the same time, but OCD takes a little longer. I have ASD instead of AS. No, that's right. Autism spectrum disorder. So this is one where one of the things that we see change pretty quickly when autism spectrum kids do NeurOptimal, assuming that, well, let me start with this, which is that for some kids who are very sensitive to sensory experiences, the training starts slowly and builds up. So first they have to get comfortable with the sensors. And often that could be like putting the sensors on a teddy bear or just clipping them on their hands or clipping them on their parents. And then gradually working up to having them on their heads and start with short sessions. So you can change the length of the neurofeedback session, the NeurOptimal session. So you can start with a 5-minute session. And some parents who have very sensitive kids will train them when they're sleeping. So again, the brain listens even when it's asleep. So it's effective training to do it when they're sleeping. And so some parents opt to do that in the beginning, and then they can transition to the kids tolerating it. And the reason for that is because what we see in this sensitivity is that part of the very important function of the brain is it's supposed to only send enough sensory data into conscious awareness that we need to be able to be responsive to the information that's coming through those sense perceptions. But for whatever reason, with autism spectrum, kids, a lot of them, that gateway is not closed enough. And so too much sensory data floods them. And so they can't make eye contact. They don't like things on their skin. And so when they do the NeurOptimal training, the brain sees that it's doing that and that it's maladaptive, and it starts to function much better at keeping sensory information out of awareness. So then they're not flooded. So then there's all sorts of other things that can happen because that data isn't front and center for them. And then they can transition to tolerating doing the sessions and having the sensors on. And so it helps with that aspect of autism spectrum. It helps with that stress response, specifically mood regulation. So there aren't the highs and the lows. They're much better able to be regulated, less reactive. And, you know, for those families, I encourage them, if they can afford it, to actually buy a system and train consistently throughout child development. Because there are more stressors, and certainly the parents could benefit as well, because you know, it's a stressful situation at times. So ADHD or ADD, we get a lot of families who rent systems for that, and typically, again, sorry, I see someone has a question here, but I'll answer that in a second. So with ADHD, again, if a parent also trains, super helpful. There is not always, but often a more chaotic family system connected to ADHD. And so what we find is that chaos of the family system becomes more organized when we have a parent also training. But it's not always the case. It's just sometimes, but then also the child's brain obviously trains and does well. And typically for those families, kids train 3 to 4 times a week for 2 to 3 months. And they're usually pretty happy with the results. We do have tracking tools. So we use self-reporting checklists. And you rate symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10, and you fill them out once a month. So with kids with ADHD, you know, you can let teachers know. You can ask teachers to fill out the checklists. It's not necessary. I was talking to a mom a couple of weeks ago, and she said, I knew when it was really working because the school stopped calling me. And so for some families, you know, those are really the signs that the neurofeedback is helping. And for families where they're not seeing shifting happening in the first month, so after 1 month, we should see some of those 10s becoming 8s or 7s on the checklist. And if they're not, that's usually when we start asking questions about diet, particularly in ADHD. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that there are lots of cofactors. And while NeurOptimal can help that brain to reset itself, if there are underlying biological issues, so toxicity, heavy metal toxicity is something that can produce what looks like an anxiety disorder. If that heavy metal isn't detoxed, that anxiety is probably not going to go away despite the NeurOptimal. So when there is biologically based reasons, those still also need to be addressed. But the nice thing is, if we don't see the shifting that we would expect from, you know, a month of training, we should start to see numbers changing there. Then we know there's probably some organic biological contributor. And so we get to do some digging and exploring what else could be going on here. And so let's see, somebody had a question, and let me just see if I can, pull that up here. Do you offer people cognitive behavioral therapy online? Well, with OCD, she's been using NeurOptimal for a month and a half. She needs more support. So we don't offer the cognitive behavioral therapy to go alongside the OCD. That would be something that I would encourage you to look for locally. Psychology Today website, if you're looking for a referral source, they have a find a therapist feature, and you can search for someone who specializes in OCD in children. That's the best thing. And it's great that you're recognizing that she needs that extra support. So thanks, Michelle. That's your daughter's very lucky to have you there. Let's see. Where are we at here? We're at the end in terms of what I wanted to say. If any of you have any questions, you can unmute yourself and just ask a question, or you can put it in the chat window. Either one is fine. So for those of you who want a better understanding of how NeurOptimal works, I encourage you to go to our website, actually the neurofeedbacktraining.com, and then /webinar. That's how you can get to that webinar, and it's more of a deep dive into how NeurOptimal is different than other neurofeedback systems, the protocol systems, how it works in more detail. Let's see, we have a question here. Oh yes, can they still take ADHD medication while brain training? How long does it usually take to come off the ADHD medications? That's a great question. Definitely children can stay on their ADHD medication while they're training. And I would, work with the physician who prescribed to let them know that you're doing neurofeedback, and that you want to know what would be the signs that it's time to start tapering them off their medication. So work as a team to know when to do that. But typically for children, 3 months of neurofeedback is usually a really good foundation. And you could start, discussing with your providing physician about how to taper off and what to be looking for in terms of signs that they're now over-medicated. So one of the things that has been observed with NeurOptimal is that when people are doing the brain training, the brain actually uses those drugs more efficiently. And so actually less becomes more. But again, something to discuss and decide with your physician who's the prescriber. And someone made a good point that chiropractic checkups and clinical nutrition are great adjuncts to neurofeedback. So again, just thinking about the holistic approach, those are very helpful things. And, when it comes to diet, if you don't want it to be a parent-child power struggle, having your child talk to a nutritionist or, a more holistic pediatrician. Unfortunately, most standard pediatricians have been taught the food pyramid, which is not the most current thinking about best nutrition practices. So you really want someone who has a more holistic approach. Dr. Mark Hyman, who is a functional medicine doctor, he's got lots of educational materials, but sometimes having your kids go talk to somebody who's not the parent can be helpful, because it takes it out of the struggle of power that can happen between a parent and a child. So just an idea. And in terms of in what order to do things, if there is a lot of chaos or just a really busy schedule, and it's like, whoa, I can't do all of this at once, which is very understandable. Starting with the NeurOptimal is a really good place to start, because again, as that brain gets regulated, comes more into that zone of regulation, which is when we're calm, we're centered, we're better able to focus, better able to plan and to be organized. So then it becomes much more easy to add in the pieces. And I've witnessed over and over again that what happens is the brain starts to ask for what it's need, and it can come out very spontaneously. So for example, I had a fellow training, and he came in, it was probably around his 10th, 12th session. And he said, Natalie, I finally decided to go back to the gym. And it can arise as just sort of this spontaneous thought. But what's underneath that is that there is that stability and regulation happening, so that now that message can come through. Hey, I need exercise. If I'm really going to, optimize and going to have the best brain waves possible, I need you to exercise me, right? So that brain can ask for that, and the message can be received, and we can actually follow through. And I've heard people say that spontaneously about their diet as well. They say it about relationships. So another thing, and I'll use my daughter as an example, because it was kind of a spontaneous understanding that I received based on her training, which is that she started to not be as attracted to dysregulated kids. And it would come out with things like, I'd say, well, what do you think of the new kid, Sally, in class? And she'd be like, and this was when she was small, like 7, 8, she'd be like, I don't know. She's a lot of energy, right? So there's this sense of there being dysregulation, and the regulated brain is not as attracted to dysregulation, because dysregulation takes a lot of energy. So if a regulated brain is going to be connected to a dysregulated brain, it's going to take energy, because again, that fight flight energy, that hyperarousal takes more to be active. And then in a sort of more sophisticated way, people will start to say things like, wow, I realize that when I hang out with so-and-so, it's really not a lot of fun. They're really negative, or they're kind of aggressive. And again, it's that sensitivity of recognizing what's happening in their environment and not being as attracted. Very organically, the brain is not attracted to dysregulation, whether that's anger, anxiety, hopelessness, despair, right? They don't want to merge with it. And that's that unconscious brain recognizing, ooh, no, I don't actually, that's not good. That's not a good connection, which doesn't mean that people, just abandon everybody, but they're just better able to discern health from maybe what's less healthy in relationships, which, we could all benefit from having better discernment there. So let's see, any other questions at this time? Let's see. Looks like we're through those. So I'm not sure what time it is, but we're through the presentation. Thank you all for joining. And my email is there. Please feel free to follow up with an email if you have specific questions you want to ask me. If you want to do more learning, We got lots of content on our blogs and on our YouTube video. So, I just encourage you to, keep educating yourself, and yeah, have a great weekend. And we will see you next time. All right. Take care.